Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever and whenever you are watching this. My name is Hannah, and my topic for this week is Aboriginal peoples of Australia and their cultures and their traditions. I firstly just want to go ahead and get into the terminology that should be used when discussing Aboriginal people and their history. Personally, I was always under the assumption that the word Aboriginal was bad, and it was, similar to how in the US people still use, Indian instead of the word Native American. I thought it was incorrect, and it just kind of stuck around with the generations. After I did research, I did go ahead and find the correct terminology, and I thought I would share it with everyone first so that we can go ahead and be just all a little bit more informed together. So some of the terms that they personally prefer to be referred to as are Aboriginal people or peoples. Aboriginal person is also one of them, or simply calling them by, the nation or clan that they are descendants of. So for example, the Murray people, or the Core people, or the Guri people. Some of the terms that should not be used are Aborigines, especially. This term has a lot of racist connections that go back years in the past, so it's best to just not even use this one altogether. I did discover also that they don't like to be referred to as native or natives. This is just based on personal preference. The terms black fella, white fella, and yellow fella have also been used in the past, but these are not appropriate to use as well. Before we get into their traditions and their culture, I do want to go ahead and touch base with some of the history, because I do feel that learning about their history is so important to understanding the bigger picture of all of this. So getting into it, the Aboriginal people did come over during the Ice Age from Southeast Asia. They had rich culture, and they were very, very developed in language, and they were also skilled hunters and gatherers. When the ice began to melt around 15,000 years ago, they moved inland from their caves towards the coastlines, and they named themselves the Palawa people. They continued to grow their culture and build ceremonial sites along all of the coastlines that they inhabited, and eventually they began to expand and move across the land, where they branched off into different clans, and they each had their own language. It was thought that at one point they grew to be over 500 nations, which would be around 750,000 people. One area that became very populated by the Aboriginal people was near the area that we now know as Sydney, Australia. These clans lived in this area for thousands of years before the European colonizers arrived. Here, they lived near the harbors, and they were skilled at hunting and fishing, and they established good trading relationships with the clans around them, so that they didn't have to travel very far to get any supplies that they ever needed. Their system worked so well that they only had to work about 4 to 5 hours per day to survive, and the rest of the time was spent doing leisure activities, and this developed their culture and their language a lot. They also traveled when the seasons would change to follow migration. This is an image that I thought would be really useful to include, and honestly, it's just really interesting to take a look at. If you want to go ahead and pause the video, go ahead just so you can get a better look at it, but I'm just going to talk about it really briefly. So this map shows a depiction of all of the known Aboriginal clans and their estimated borders. So you can see that there's quite a few, and keep in mind that each of them had their own traditions, cultures, languages, all of that. Now, towards the 1700s is when the British did arrive on Aboriginal land. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook arrived in Sydney, Australia under the instructions to take possession of the southern continent if it was uninhabited, or with the consent of the natives if it was occupied. Well, in typical fashion, Mr. Cook didn't even gain consent. He basically stepped foot on the land, declared it to now be known as New South Wales, and said it belonged to King George III. James Cook and his men didn't stay in New South Wales for long because they weren't on a settlement mission, more of an exploration one, so they left pretty shortly after when they got there. But the first settlement ship arrived in January of 1788, and it was the first fleet led by Captain Arthur Phillip. Right away, the Europeans didn't like the way the Aboriginal people lived. Diary accounts called them stupid, barbaric, and primitive. Watkin Trench was an officer of the First Fleet, and he said in his diary this about the people. It does not appear that these poor creatures have any fixed habitation, sometimes sleeping in the cavern of rock, which they make as warm as an oven, by lighting a fire in the middle of it. They will take up their abode here, for one night perhaps, then in another the next night. Around 700 members of the First Fleet crew were actually British convicts, so I feel like this kind of sets the stage for how the Aboriginal people were treated for many years to come. So at this point, I do want to go ahead and go into the culture of the Aboriginal people. just a little bit. So when the British arrived, they didn't acknowledge that these people had any form of intelligence because it was not the intelligence that they were used to seeing back home. But what they didn't realize is that the Aboriginal people lived the way that they did out of choice. They believed that no one man owned the land and that they were all just caretakers of it. They also believed in having a kinship with the environment around them. So like I said before, there were hundreds of clans of Aboriginal peoples. Today, I just want to go ahead and focus on one, and that would be the Wiradjuri people. They were the largest nation in New South Wales and had thousands within their clan. One of the things that they emphasized as part of their culture was the importance of dreaming. And dreaming is a way that they got all of their guidance, from who they should marry to how they should live or other important life decisions. They were divided into different groups within the land, consisting anywhere from 10 to 100 people per group. Every member in a group had their important roles, but everyone took part. Both men and women were hunters and gatherers, and they took pride in educating every single member. Women were the primary educators, and they would teach their members from when they were small children all the way through adulthood. Like others around them, they were semi-nomadic, and they traveled with the seasons. They would even wear skin from possum or kangaroo during the cold months. 1 to 2 times per year, the entire nation would come together for large ceremonial rituals. They would dance, sing, and participate in large trades between the groups. One of the smaller ceremonies that would take place was called Burbung, and this was an initiation ritual given to young boys. In this initiation, they would test various skills, and leaders from nearby groups would often come and visit to watch. Another tradition of theirs was keeping family totems. Totems represented the animal that the group or family was associated with, and it was a big indicator to other groups of who their allies and enemies were. People from the same totem could actually not get married. The Wiradjuri were also skilled in art and body painting. They made their paints from grease and crushed up minerals and would very often paint their bodies for ceremonies and rituals. Tree carvings were probably my favorite ritual of theirs that I learned about. So tree carvings actually marked ceremonial and burial sites, as far as, their sacred sites. And this is actually a picture of just one of the tree carvings that they would do. Each carving was different and it varied in complexity. More important men in the groups were given very complex tree carvings at their burial sites because it was thought that these carvings provided a pathway for their spirit. And I really think that these are just so beautiful. So as I talked about before, these ceremonial sites, burial sites, and dreaming sites were all sacred to the Wiradjuri people. Each of them had their own purpose, but the main reason generally for all of them was to connect with the spirits of the land in one way or another. One of their well-known ceremonial sites was called Indiamara, and it was located at the edge of Wagga Wagga overlooking a river. Indiamara actually means give honor, be respectful, polite, gentle, patient, and honest with each other. And this land was very, very special to them. So now that we've talked about the Aboriginal cultures and traditions, I want to go ahead and jump back into the history aspect of things so that we can develop how it will change and why it changed so much into what it is today. Back in New South Wales, the British actually relied heavily on the Aboriginal people to survive their first year there. They knew the lands and where to find food, so the British essentially used them for their knowledge, but they were still incredibly hostile towards them. With them, the British also brought new diseases that the Aboriginal people had never been exposed to before, so they had no immunity against it. By the end of the first year, over half of their population was killed by syphilis, influenza, and smallpox. During this time, some of the Aboriginal people were still trying to make peace and negotiate with the British. In May 1789, they actually captured one of them named Bennelong, and they essentially did what they call civilizing him. He dressed in traditional British clothing, and he became a middleman for negotiation between the British and the Aboriginal people. Bennelong's wife hated what he had become, and refused to do the same like he wanted her to, and when she gave birth, she wished to do it on their sacred land like she had planned. The governor at the time, Governor Phillip, didn't like this, and he forced her to give birth in the hospital, which she was terrified of, and she associated it with death. And unfortunately, she did end up dying in childbirth in that hospital. One story that I do want to go ahead and talk about as well is the story of Lieutenant William Dawes. William was an engineer officer on the First Fleet, and he was also a mathematician and astronomer. He was a really smart guy, and he actually had a lot of interest in learning and growing as a person. When he did reside in New South Wales, he befriended a young Aboriginal girl named Patagarong. Him and Patagarong actually became very close, and they taught each other's first languages. William kept a notebook detailing everything that she taught him about their language, and it was actually the first written record of their language, and it was extremely detailed. He was the first European that they had met that tried to become an advocate for them and appreciated their culture. His time in New South Wales was not long, though, because he did disobey the governor on an order to hunt down and kill an Aboriginal person. Jumping over to the history of the Aboriginal people in Tasmania, I did want to talk briefly about what happened over there as well and the history behind it. So Abel Tasman had first mapped what is now called Tasmania back in 1642, but the first contact with the Aboriginal people was not made until 1772 by the French. At the time, the French didn't stay long in Tasmania because they were at war with Britain and they didn't want to get involved anymore. So the first settlement was established in Risdon Cove in 1803 by the British, who came along shortly after. The same things killing Aboriginal people in Sydney were also killing them in Tasmania, essentially disease and hostile relationships with the British settlers. By 1830, the British population was at 23,500, and in 1818, the Aboriginal population fell to less than 2,000 people. One of the biggest wars in Aboriginal history was named the Black War. It began in 1824 after George Arthur took place as the new governor. He was really cruel to the Aboriginal people, and they fought back. So by 1828, he labeled them as open enemies, where it became legal to shoot them on sight and raid their homes. The Black Line was also established in 1828, and this was a plan for removing and relocating Aboriginal people. Colonists formed a line stretching across the land and forced people from Oyster Bay, Big River, and the North Midlands out. If they survived, they would be relocated to islands off the coast of Tasmania. Only around 300 people of the Aboriginals did survive this. Going back to the Sydney area of New South Wales, in June 1838, a very different type of massacre happened. Settlers in the area of Mile Creek had established a pretty good relationship with the Aboriginal people, and they would sing and dance together really often. One night, convict settlers from a nearby area rounded up a group of Aboriginal people, including women and children, and massacred them for no reason. It is believed that about 28 of them were massacred, but no one knows the exact number. These convicts were actually tried and publicly hanged for the massacre, and this was the first time that British subjects had been punished for crimes against Aboriginal people. Moving forward, the mistreatment of Aboriginal people, it didn't stop. In 1860, it became legal to relocate Aboriginal children. Between 1860 and 1970, thousands of children were stolen by police from their homes or walking to school, walking back from school, and they were placed with non-Aboriginal new parents. They were told to forget their past and they were taught English. If they spoke their old language or practiced any of their old cultural rituals, they were beaten for it. Today, there are over 17,000 living stolen generation survivors in Australia, and many of them have searched for their families that they were taken from for years. And this has created what's called, intergenerational trauma. It's a trauma that's been passed down from these people who directly experienced it to their children and their children's children, because they had this culture and this language once, and all of a sudden when it's taken from them, it creates a form of trauma that, it's very hard to heal and get back all of that. There are over 649,000 people living in Australia today who identify as being of Aboriginal descent. Because of the stolen generation, a lot of them have lost touch with their culture and language that they once had, because they don't have the parents and grandparents that were there for everyone else to go ahead and teach them that and pass that down from generation to generation. However, the Australian government has really stepped up in the last few years, and they do promote and fund resources for the Aboriginal people. Programs have been set up to teach new generations about cultures and tradition in order to keep the Aboriginal people and their customs alive. Out in Australia, they do actually have media stations and promotions that, they show TV and movies just in an Aboriginal language, and I feel like this really does promote their culture and it does expand it to the new generation. Sadly, many of the nations that thrived once have died out, and those that are still around, they take pride in who they are, and they wish to share the culture with the world, which I do really love. I just want to first thank you all for listening into my presentation today, and I really hope that I did teach you all something new, because I definitely did learn a lot that I was unaware of, and I do feel more all around educated about the subject than I ever have. To see a culture go from a once thriving culture with amazing language development and arts and tradition and rituals to, you know, today they're trying to rebuild that because so much of it was lost. Is so heartbreaking, and unfortunately it does happen across so many different people across the world, from their ancient cultures to now. What did happen to them was absolutely horrible, but I do praise the Australian government for trying to make amends and, all of this funding to go ahead and try to fix that, so that they can go ahead and try to bring back their culture and keep it alive, and get back to practicing those traditions and those cultures again. Um, Once again, I do want to thank you all, and I hope you have an amazing day wherever you are.